Hello, I'm Diana Rife, the Artistic Director of the Charleston Literary Festival. I'd like to welcome our speakers, audience and donors. If the past 4 to 18 months has taught us anything, it is that books and their authors, whether classical or contemporary, really matter. In trying times, readers turn to books for insights into the human condition, for the opportunity to be transported to other worlds, for ideas, for arguments, for inspiration, for experiencing the impossible, for laughter, and for the release of tears. The festival will provide the opportunity to engage with a galaxy of literary and artistic stars, as well as up-and-coming writers who are making waves. We have a far-flung cast list featuring authors from all over the United States, as well as the United Kingdom and elsewhere. Whether they're talking about former literary trailblazers, or gene editing, or human rights, or popular culture, or feminism, or medieval nuns, or groundbreaking films, or innumerable other subjects, they have one thing in common: the ability of compelling stories to linger in our imaginations. We're grateful to all our speakers, whether virtual or in person, for sharing their talents. Please thank them by purchasing their books. The festival couldn't happen without a committed team and board. We would like to thank our donors, both private and public, who generously make the festival possible. The College of Charleston, our academic partner, has been an invaluable source of support. It is no accident that the festival takes place in Charleston, a prime destination with a progressive literary and artistic tradition. I hope that you enjoy all the events and that they make you think and dream afresh.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. I'm Andrew Shue, president of the College of Charleston. On behalf of the students, staff, faculty, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this beautiful, historic Satili Theater. We're so glad that you can join us here today. For those of you who are in person with us here today, this might be the first time you've been in this beautiful venue since it's been renovated, because we opened it up really during the pandemic, and we haven't had many public events here, and this might be one of the first ones. I want to point, well, it's kind of dark in here. I don't know if the light shines directly in my eyes. I don't know if you can see the beautiful theater that is. Oh, good, we have lights, so I feel powerful. Let there be light. In fact, I want to talk to you a little bit about the renovation, and for those of you who had been here before, you probably remember this place, I guess, because it was a movie theater at one point. They had to put these sound panels on the walls, and that completely covered the murals on your left and right. And when we discovered the murals back in 2011, we decided to leave them open and visible, but it was completely damaged by the adhesions that were used at the time to affix the panels. And thanks to the support of the Albert Satili Foundation, we were able to completely restore those panels. And in fact, these large-scale murals required the expertise of art conservator Catherine Rogers, who developed a specialized solvent to remove the hundreds of black tar adhesives that were used to attach the acoustic tiles to the walls. And these classically inspired murals were done by an Italian, or actually several Italian artists from New York City. One mural on my right and your left depicts a centaur and nymphs, and the other one on my left suggests music and drama. I think you will agree with me that they are indeed stunning, and we're so glad to be able to bring that back to life to all of our visitors. The College of Charleston is delighted to be the official academic partner for the Charleston Literary Festival starting this year, and to play host to so many great minds and great talents. It is my honor to introduce an exciting conversation with Carl Zimmer about his newest book, Life's Edge, The Search for What It Means to Be Alive. Mr. Zimmer is a wonderful reflection of a liberal arts education in practice. As an undergraduate at Yale University, he was an English major, and he has used that liberal arts training and those skills in critical thinking, analysis, and communication to become one of the most respected science journalists in the world. In addition to writing for the New York Times, the Atlantic, National Geographic, Time, and other distinguished publications, he has authored 14 books on science. Mr. Zimmer has won countless awards and fellowships and teaches science writing at his alma mater. Today, he will discuss the enigma of what it means to be alive with biologist Beth Meyer-Bernstein, our own Dean of the Honors College here at the College of Charleston. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Carl Zimmer and Dean Meyer-Bernstein.
Thank you so much for coming. I thought before Beth and I had our conversation, I could talk to you a little bit about the book that I've written. Could I have the first slide, please? So, to write this book, I spent some time with other living things. This is Monty. Monty's a snake, and I went down to Tuscaloosa, where there's a scientist named Stephen Secor who studies snakes, and spent some quality time with some very big snakes. Snakes are alive. They're alive like we are. We may not swallow a rabbit whole the way Monty can, but we have to eat. Monty has to eat. We have that in common. There's certain hallmarks of life, and maybe some of us, like Monty, do it in a much more spectacular fashion than others. This may not look like a very promising place to go look for living things. This is an abandoned mine in the Adirondacks, where they used to get graphite for pencils. There's pretty much nothing in there these days except for bats. They will spend the winter in there. And what's amazing to me about these bats is that, they are able to keep the insides of their body in a very stable environment. The whole world is changing around them. It's cold in the winter, it's warm in the summer, they have to fly around, they have to hibernate, and yet they are able to keep a stability inside of their bodies. And so do we. We have a stable body temperature, blood pressure, our blood sugar barely changes at all. That's called homeostasis, and that's something else that is a hallmark of life. Reproduction is another one, but reproduction takes all sorts of strange forms. So where I live in Connecticut, we're surrounded with maple trees, and maple trees are spectacular at reproduction. Because they produce these samaras which rain down all over the place. They fill our gutters. They're kind of a nightmare. But When it goes to just this exuberance of life, for reproduction, you can't beat maple trees. This is also alive. This is something called a slime mold. And if you go walking in the woods in the summer, you may see something like this just on the forest floor. This is actually one giant cell, and it just sends out tentacles to find food. And scientists love to study slime molds. I actually went to a lab in Newark, New Jersey, where they just study slime molds. The reason being that these things, they're just a cell, there's no brain, but they can figure out their environment, they can find food, they can build networks between their food and come up with the best way to connect them. In a sense, they're solving mathematical problems by doing this. They have an intelligence. And then you could also argue that intelligence is also a hallmark of life. So there are these things about life that unify living things. You know, we can run down this list of characteristics. And in my book, I look at how scientists have struggled and are still struggling to take all those things in common about life and actually answer a very simple question. What is life? This is a question that was asked by a German chemist named Georg Stahl in 1708. What is life? He's the first person to ask this as a scientific question this way, but people have been asking it ever since. And that question has pushed people to try to figure out, well, can we find the borderland of life? Can we find the edge of life? What divides life from non-life? Because we're made of matter the way non-living things are, so how are we different? And this has been such a struggle that there have been scientists who have made terrible mistakes, big blunders in the history of science. So in the 1870s, if you opened up a zoology textbook and wanted to learn about the living things on the planet, this was page 1. This was something called Bathybius. This was believed to be the most basic form of life, that it carpeted the ocean floor. It wasn't even a cell. It was just protoplasm. It had this mysterious quality of life. It doesn't exist. This is a complete myth. It has a name. It does not exist. It was just a fluke of bad chemistry, and people wanted to believe that something like this existed, and it didn't. And there are all sorts of examples like this where you get to that border between life and non-life. It's very treacherous. Now you might say, well, look, we've got DNA now. This is all solved, right? Well, DNA is not alive. I mean, it's just a molecule. In and of itself, it's not alive. And so even now, we're struggling with some of these issues. And it's really like, it's not like some obscure corner of the world where we deal with this. Viruses, for example, our whole world's been turned upside down by one virus. This is another virus called tobacco mosaic virus. It infects tobacco plants. There are lots of viruses, and no one can agree on whether viruses are alive or not. So viruses have this particular kind of structure where they have genes. In the case of this virus, it's RNA and protein. So it's very different than your cells, where there's all sorts of metabolism going on because you're eating things. Viruses don't eat. You can turn them into crystals like salt. And then you can take those crystals and put them back into water, and they're viruses again. You can keep them as crystals for months. And then what happens is that they invade cells, and then the cells make new viruses. So it's not like the viruses grow and divide. When we get infected with a virus, we're the ones making the new viruses. It's us. It's our atoms reorganized into viruses. So is a virus alive? Well, how do you define life? I'll give you one example from NASA. NASA has this sort of working definition. Life is a self-sustained chemical system capable of undergoing Darwinian evolution. So viruses, they can evolve. They're really good. The Delta variant that's driving us all crazy, that's the product of evolution. But they're not a self-sustained chemical system. Like I told you, a virus doesn't eat. A virus doesn't have a body temperature or blood pressure. They don't have any of that. So are they half alive? Can something be half alive? That doesn't seem to make sense to us. A virologist named Norman Peary in the 1930s, he answered this very hard question with this very beautiful passage, which I include in the book. When one is asking whether a virus is living or dead, the only sensible answer is, I don't know. We know a number of things it will do and a number of things it won't, and if someone will define the word living, I will try to see how the virus fits into the definition. So in a way, like we think about life as being just a scientific question, but in a way, maybe it's more a philosophical question. What do we mean? What does life mean to us? And just to finish up before I start the conversation with Beth, I just want to sort of use an analogy of water. What is water? Well, imagine asking that question in 1500. The people with the most expertise would be alchemists. Alchemists were very interested in water, and they had very elaborate explanations for what water is. But they tended to define water as just a list of hallmarks. Water's wet, water's transparent, water can dissolve certain things. But if you just have a list of things, then that gets you into trouble. Because what happens when water freezes? Okay, well, it's not liquid anymore. Now you have something called ice. But since we said that a hallmark of water is that it's wet, well, this isn't water anymore. And there would be these clear liquids that alchemists would find that could dissolve other things, that could dissolve metal. So they'd say like, well, it's sort of water, but it's not. We'll call it noble water. Now, noble water and water are totally different things. Noble water is a certain kind of acid. It's not water. And yet, there was no way that anybody, including Leonardo da Vinci, at the time could figure this out. How is it that water could be so many different things? How could water be so confusing? And he has this wonderful passage where it says, one would say that water suffers change into as many natures as there are the different places through which it passes. What we really needed was a theory of water, and that didn't exist for 3 centuries after Leonardo da Vinci. So we can talk about water in terms of atoms, elements, molecules. We know that ice is water because it's those water molecules in a different organization. So we need that kind of language to talk about life. And as I argue in the book, we're not there yet. There are scientists who are working on that, developing a theory so that we can talk about life in the same way that we can talk about water. This is really not a story of a big scientific success. There's a lot of failure, but I think we will succeed. It will just be sometime in the future. So this is like a forward-looking book to the day that we can finally answer that question of what is life. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl, for being here today.
My pleasure.
So, what does it mean to be alive? That's a really big question. So what was your motivation to write a book that really asks a question that's one of the biggest questions, most elusive questions that has challenged humans for centuries?
Well, part of it just sort of like emerged out of just my ordinary work. So, as a journalist, I'm a science writer, and I specialize in writing about life. And, you can write about snakes or slime molds or all these particular things, and I get to go to scientists like you, and like you and I were just talking about sea anemones, so these wonderful little aquatic creatures, and that's all very cool. But if I say what is it about the sea anemone and all other living things that unites them? Well, like, what is life? I find that biologists are like, oh, whoa. Like, I can talk to you about sea anemones, but like, that's too much. And I just sort of found it interesting that this question of what is life sort of hangs over biologists in a way that, like, you know, that chemists don't have to worry about. I mean, if someone would say to a chemist, like, well, you know, okay, you study water. Well, what's a molecule? I mean, a chemist wouldn't say, like, whoa, that's too big. Like, nobody really knows what a molecule is. But the fact is that biologists don't actually agree on what life is. There are hundreds of definitions out there. And I just found that incredible. And so I just thought, like, I need to, like, just dive into this. And I think what just fascinated me the most was as people were trying to define life, they would have to search. It was like they were exploring a territory, and they were trying to find the edge of it. Like, where does life stop and non-life begin? And that edge turns out to be incredibly dangerous. So it's sort of like it's one of these books that kind of grew on me over the years.
So you just mentioned, and also you mentioned in your presentation a few minutes ago, that there were a lot of failures,
yeah.
Right? So a lot of failures and still no answers, correct? And so as a science writer, science communicator, how do you really start to have those conversations with the non-scientific community, that science is a process, and that as we go on this journey and try to find answers to these big questions, we actually learn a lot of valuable information. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a danger in writing about science to only sort of present it as sort of like just simple success. And, you know, maybe part of the problem there is that, you know, for example, we just wait for scientific papers to come out. We wait for scientists to do the hard work, and then after like 10 years of hard research, they publish a paper, and then we can come in and write about it. And so that can kind of give the illusion that, like, oh, these scientists just go from one success to another. And as you say, that's not how it goes. It's less common for us to write about the failures. And the more I write about science, the more I think that that's a really important part to get across, is that it's risky work. Things don't work out sometimes. People have great ideas that turn out to be spectacularly wrong. And that's actually part of the process. And, you know, it's, in this case, I'm writing about life, but I think we've also seen that illustrated in kind of a painful way with the pandemic, where I think the public sort of has this incredible expectation that scientists have everything all figured out all at once. So this entirely new virus comes on the scene, and then people say, like, oh, well, okay, tell us about this virus. And the scientists are like saying, like, okay, we're running experiments as fast as we can. And so then it turns out that, for example, like, this thing is airborne in a way that we didn't appreciate initially. So then all of a sudden all the advice about the virus and masking and so on changed, and people have said, like, oh, you said one thing and then now you're saying another. So I'm not going to trust you at all because you changed your mind. But that's how science works. You know, that was a failure. Not recognizing how that virus spread was a failure. But, you know, science is not above failure.
Yeah, and it does cause a lot of, I think, distrust with the scientific community. And like you said, during the pandemic, we were watching this in real time, right? See how that laid out. So communicating science is very critical, and so you've dedicated your career to this, right? So have you thought, or I guess has the value of scientific communication, you think, changed over the course of your career? I mean, most recently in the pandemic, it was very valuable, right, that this scientific information was communicated properly. But have you kind of seen any changes over the last 30 years of your career?
You know, I mean, I think that there has always been, I've always known that there's a huge curiosity and appetite about science, just among lots of other people, non-scientists, like myself. And that's always been there. How people satisfy that has been different, has evolved. But it was particularly strange, again, during the pandemic to like, suddenly, like, the science desk at the New York Times, we were like, okay, you people are like, you're our front page news, like, every day, Like, we were kind of stunned that people were really into epidemiology and RNA and all these things that we spend our days on. So I'm curious, like, how I hope that people may have learned something about how science works during the pandemic, and then going forward, maybe that will help people to sort of appreciate just the scientific process in general, like in Life's Edge, that it's this, scientists are grappling with huge unknowns, and they don't go into it knowing everything.
Yeah. So one of the things I love about your books is not only the historical context that you put these scientific discoveries in, but you also talk about the practical applications of this. So if and when we're able to define what life is, what do you think the practical application of that knowledge is? And what do you think the risks of knowing what life is could be?
Well, there are people trying to make life from scratch right now. I mean, they're working on it, and some of them are working on it in a sense, trying to sort of replicate what may have happened on the early Earth. So the idea is that there might have been these protocells that had RNA in them. So how did that come about, and how could an RNA-based form of life grow and evolve and so on? There are other people who are saying, like, there's nothing special about our chemistry. Other chemicals could do it too. And so they're actually doing large-scale chemical experiments looking for chemicals that can combine and start to show life-like qualities. Now, these things won't be, it's not like they're like creating a pathogen in the lab, but I think if you do create life from scratch and it starts to sort of take off, like, we need to be careful. Like, what are we doing? So there are potential risks there, but the benefits are tremendous. For one thing, another big question is, are we alone in the universe? Well, in other words, is there life elsewhere? And we're starting to look. There's a probe on Mars that's digging away, looking for some clues of life there right now, Perseverance. But we don't really know yet what we're looking for. And we really need to figure out what life is before we find it, and because we might not even recognize it. Wouldn't that be crazy that that we found like alien life on a moon around Saturn and we didn't even realize it because we didn't have a clear answer to that question about what life is?
So as you started this process of writing the book, you might have had some concept of what you would define life to be. How has that changed, or has it changed as you wrote the book and now you're kind of on the other end of that process?
I'm further away from a definition of life. I think simply because scientists themselves are so divided. I went to a meeting and where scientists are working on trying to make life from scratch. I mean, they have these meetings. And I said, like, I'm working on a book about life and, what it means to be alive. So presumably you people have this figured out, right? Because this is what you're trying to do. So I'd love to hear what your definition is. And people would come up to me and say, like, oh, well, obviously it's this, or obviously it's that, or this, or that, or that. Like, I kept getting, like, completely different answers, like, these are all people in one room, and, our virus is alive. One morning, I received an email from a virologist who was annoyed by something I had written in the Times about this question. He said, of course, any expert will tell you viruses are not alive. And then that afternoon, I got another email from another virologist saying, like, every expert will tell you viruses are alive. And they were both really equally annoyed at me, that I wasn't like recognizing the obviousness of it. So if they can't figure it out, who am I? But for me, it's that history of that struggle that's so fascinating. And they're just I ended up encountering so many new figures in the history of science I didn't actually know about before. Amazing researchers like Albert St. Georgi, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering vitamin C. And once he had discovered the vitamin C and got a Nobel Prize, he said, okay, now I'm ready to do some real science. And he decided to study motion in muscles because he felt like that was the defining quality of life, that we move. And he was able to find the molecular components of that in the middle of World War II while he was in hiding as a spy in Hungary, hiding from Nazis. He would like show up in his lab every now and then and say, how's the research going? And then he would disappear again. And they figured it out. It was astonishing. But even he, later in life, admitted like, the closer I got to life, the more it sort of escaped through my fingers. He acknowledged that in a way that he too had failed. An amazing scientist who just said like, I don't have this one yet.
I had the same experience as you. I mean, as a biologist, of course, we don't think about life. We don't define life, right? So, but certainly, you have this concept as a scientist. And then reading the book, I was like, I just don't know what it is anymore. So I feel the same way that you did about that.
In a way, but like, and yet that makes you sort of appreciate life all the more. Mm-hmm. Like, here's this thing, like, I think part of the problem is, not a problem, but like, we feel that we are alive. I think we would all, I, for one, will say, I feel like I am alive. And you probably have the same feeling. There are some people who, it's a psychological condition where people believe that they are dead. It's called Cotard syndrome. So it's not obvious to us that we're alive. It's a feeling we have. And I think that, so we feel that like, well, scientists can't have a very hard time with this, right? Because it's so obvious to me that I am alive. But that turns out not to be the case.
And that's really in reference to humans, right? So how do you ascribe that characteristic to, bacteria, right? How do they feel that they're alive? And how, and how do you bring that into kind of the conversation of what life is?
Yeah, it's hard to have a conversation with bacteria, so.
Yes, for sure. So you, in your book, have had some interesting experiences, right? So you showed us a picture of the snakes, which we talked about before, is not my favorite slide. And also you've been into bat caves and all sorts of exciting places. What is like the most exciting adventure that you've been on and trying to learn about what life is?
I guess that experience in that abandoned mine with bats was really an amazing experience because, you're just with these wildlife biologists who are just so fearless. I mean, we're in the Adirondacks, it's in winter, there's lots of snow on the ground, and they're like telling me to put on these like neoprene waders. Like, if you've ever put on chest waders in the snow, it's almost impossible. And they're just like getting their stuff together, and then they're like walking into this abandoned mine. This mine is basically falling apart, like, year by year, and they're going in, and they're telling me to come with them. Just don't touch anything because something might collapse, And again, like, this is their day job, and it's hard to find bats in these areas now because of this disease called white nose syndrome, which is a fungus. That's one of the real reasons that they're working so hard to track these things, because they're disappearing entirely from some caves and mines. So to be able to go into this place, into the dark, and then to find these little clusters of bats just spending the winter there. They look like little furry pears almost, and in what is otherwise a totally lifeless place, and a very place that feels very hostile to life, at least my life. That was really an amazing experience, and it was also like the last real trip I took before the pandemic began. So, it definitely looms large in my memory.
So, in your book, you talk about, you take us really on this journey, how all these different people with these different disciplines, philosophers, oceanographers, biochemists, geneticists, et cetera, attempt to define what life is and fail to now, even astrobiologists, right? So if you can think ahead to the future, who do you think is going to win this race? Like, who do you think is going to be able to answer this question? Is it, in volcanoes? Are we going to find the key to life at the bottom of the ocean, on a planet somewhere? What are your thoughts on how we're going to get there?
If I look forward, I think that biologists are going to find something really strange. Every year biologists are finding weird things. And I have a feeling that there might be some very weird form of life, maybe not even on another planet, like maybe right here. And we aren't looking with the right glasses yet. Maybe this RNA-based kind of life that people believe life began as, maybe it's still here with us. Like we're all DNA-based life, but maybe that proto-life is hiding maybe in some rocks where bacteria can't get to it and eat it up. So I'm kind of optimistic about that, but also in terms of like addressing that basic question of life, it might be not biologists. It might be, say, physicists. Physicists look at matter and try to explain why matter does weird things. So like, superconductivity is a very strange property of matter. Like if you've ever seen sometimes these levitating magnets, they're made from superconducting materials. And when people first found that, it didn't make any sense. Like matter wasn't supposed to act like this. It wasn't supposed to lose its resistance to electricity. So, but then the physicists found a theory for it. They can explain it now, and that's actually made them able to build new kinds of superconducting materials. So physicists, when you talk to physicists, they look at us as, very interesting little clusters of atoms. They're like, okay, life is a very strange form of matter, and we want to explain it. So it might be the physicists, not the biologists, who finally get this sorted.
So if you were giving advice to students in the audience, perhaps, that wanted to be able to answer this question, major in physics. That's what you're saying. Maybe double major in physics and biology?
Well, I'll put it this way. Like, if you're studying physics, you might want to take a look at life.
Yeah.
Because physics defies lots of the rules of physics. It doesn't make sense. And physicists have been, for over a century, physicists have been saying like, okay, life is a really, really hard problem. They still say that, but they are making some progress.
So now that COVID is kind of coming to an end, and maybe you'll be able to travel some more, what's your next adventure that you're going on? Do you have some plans to meet with a really cool scientist somewhere, or what are your plans?
I basically went straight from working on this book to working like crazy on the news coverage of COVID with my colleagues at the Times. I was very patted myself on the back if I wrote a column once a week, but we would be filing things like 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes a couple times a day. And I've been waiting for that news to slow down, to sort of clear a mental space for that. But yeah, the pandemic is still, I'm optimistic that we're going to be getting through things. We're vaccinated. You and I are talking without masks, and I'm not freaking out because it's okay. And there was news today of a pill that it looks like it's incredibly potent against the virus. So I'm I'm optimistic, but like it's still the news of the day. So I need to sort of wait for that. I'm hoping maybe in 2 or 3 months I'll be able to think like, what's the next book? But not quite yet.
This one's hard to follow up with, the big question that you asked. So I think we have a few minutes for questions from the audience. I don't know who's monitoring those. So I think I see a hand up over there, and I think, yes, we've got someone in the audience with a microphone that'll come to you.
First, thank you for a really interesting discussion. I think I understood you to say that there are scientists who are working on creating new life forms, not necessarily using the molecules that, I guess the organic molecules that we're used to. And so my question is, are there any naturally evolving life forms that do not rely on either DNA or RNA? And maybe this is unanswerable, but if not, why not? I mean, what is so unique that we don't have other?
Right.
To my knowledge, I'm a recovering zoology major from, I don't know, 40 years ago, but could you comment on that?
Oh yeah, no, I'd love to. It's a great question. So life on Earth is, in some ways, it's incredibly fascinating and diverse. I just showed you everything from slime molds to snakes. And yet, on another level, it's incredibly boring in that, like, we all have DNA. The only exception is viruses, some of whom use RNA, but that's basically a single-stranded version of DNA. So why is life on Earth so boring? It could just be that that's just what got started here and took over, and then there was no opportunity for anything else to start. It could be like that's it. Like in the whole periodic table, like that's the only combination that can get you life. But we don't know. And so there is no life on Earth that we know of that doesn't use like a cellular form of life that doesn't use DNA. And there's sort of a code, a genetic code that from the DNA to proteins, and it's basically the same in all living things, just across the board. We don't know of any real exception to that. So, but there are scientists who have argued like it doesn't have to be that way, and they've actually built molecules that act like DNA. In other words, they can sort of be copied in a way that our DNA is copied, but it's not DNA. It's a different kind of backbone. So. So that's a completely open question, and it remains open. And so we'll start to find that answer either by people making alternate forms of life or finding alternate forms of life somewhere else. But you're not going to find alternate forms of life if you say, like, okay, I've got a little machine that detects DNA. Like, you won't find alternate life if all you're looking for is DNA. You won't find it. So we have to broaden our perspective.
I think we've got one over there.
So if we find a non-carbon base for life, should there be some type of religious implication?
I guess I would leave that to the theologians. I mean, and also, like, I would imagine that would be a hugely profound event and would make us think about our place in the universe. But what happens if it turns out that there's life on Mars and it's just like life here, where it's not, it's just more DNA-based life? Then, did it start on Mars and come to Earth, or vice versa, or did it originate twice in the same way? These will all be. I mean, I can't wait for those discoveries and then the conversation that follows. I mean, certainly like theologians have talked a lot about what it would mean to find life or other forms of life. I mean, they are sort of preparing for that, as it were. But I'm not going to say like what we ought to be feeling or not. I would just be curious to see.
I'd like to go back to something you stated very early in the discussion, and you talked about the edge of life and non-life as being, I believe you said, dangerous.
Yes.
Could you comment on that, please?
Sure. So it's really, if you look at the history of science, there again and again, people try to find that boundary. And it becomes a very treacherous thing because you can be very easily fooled into thinking that you found something that's, alive but right at that line. So I showed you Bathybius before. That was discovered by Thomas Huxley, like one of the greatest biologists of all time. And he made a big deal about it. He gave lectures about it all over the place and saying how it was that in the 1860s, he was saying this fundamentally changes how we think about life itself. This is the essence of life. And then, some other scientists who were trying to look for it on a research ship realized he had screwed up. And they wrote him a letter, and they're like, I'm sorry, but this thing is just not there. And to his credit, he immediately sent that letter. He forwarded it to the journal Nature and said, you should publish this. And he wrote a note saying, like, if anybody made a mistake here, it's me. So I think that was how he was able to salvage his reputation. But there are other people I write about in the book, like there's a physicist named John Butler Burke, who I'm sure none of you have heard of. I hadn't heard of him until I started working on the book. But in 1904, 1905, he was an international celebrity, and he was being compared to Darwin because he had created what he called, and he was the first person to use the phrase, artificial life. He put radium into sterilized broth, and it looked to him like tiny little microbe-like things had formed. He called them radiobes. And everyone believed that radiobes were real, that maybe this is how life itself had begun. This was like front page headline news until it turned out that they didn't exist. Now, Burke refused to acknowledge that he was wrong, and he went down in flames. His career was destroyed, he went bankrupt, and everything he wrote about later was just a very sad, desperate attempt to insist that radiobes were real. So that's kind of the example of the danger that I'm talking about, because it's very hard to tell where you are relative to that edge.
There's a few more questions down here.
The writer, Franz Kafka, said the meaning of life is that it ends. So in your search for what life is, what are your thoughts about what happens, whether it's human or other creatures? How do we define death? And since 60 or 70% of us is water and bacteria, etc., you must have thought about how do we define the end?
Absolutely, yeah. And I have a chapter about exactly that in the book. Because, we can think about that sort of territory of life as being like, the territory of all living things. But we can also think about, even our own lives. They're bounded. There was a beginning and there's an end. And how do we draw those lines? And those turn out to be actually surprisingly complicated as well. What's interesting is that doctors in the late 18th century, early 19th century, they were thinking about life as being a vital force. And they really thought that this was a thing, that was like, that you could actually characterize. I mean, it sounds kind of mystical, but They thought you could study it scientifically. And one French physician said, life is essentially like the sum of these vital forces by which death is resisted. So basically, like, if you're not dead, you're alive. He was actually really did some very important work in understanding just in our bodies how it's not like any one organ is essential to life, but there's this connection. He was kind of interested in the heart, the lungs, and the brain. He sometimes called this a tripod. This is someone named Bichat, a French physician. But then doctors had a totally new situation to deal with once ventilators were invented. Because now all of a sudden, you could take away one of the legs of that tripod and people would still be alive. In the sense that their lungs were working and their heart was working, even if their brain couldn't help anymore. So then we had to redefine death. We said, that death is brain death. That's really in a way, more of a statement of values than anything. Even death is a very complicated issue. And, animals, there are some animals that just play around with the line between life and death in ways that are just amazing. There's a third state of being that scientists refer to as cryptobiosis, where an animal is not alive, it's not dead, it's something in between. So these little animals called tardigrades that live in the soil and the water, they can become completely dehydrated and survive maybe for over a century. And then you put them back in water and they're back alive again. And the reason is that they are able to basically create a bunch of molecules in their cells that basically turn their cells into a kind of protein glass. So they're not alive by any stretch of the definition, but they're not dead. So even as we're grappling with brain death and so on, these animals are finding their own ways of messing with our sense of that line between life and death.
Sometimes when we have trouble finding answers to questions, sometimes the question itself is invalid. And so I was wondering, how would you know if the question itself was invalid and there wasn't a defining line, and what would that significance be?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was thinking along the same lines as I was working on this book, which is why I would end up talking a lot with philosophers along with scientists. And so one philosopher named Carol Cleland at the University of Colorado, she's argued very forcefully that seeking a definition of life is a complete waste of time. And what she argues is that, the problem is that scientists don't know enough philosophy, in the sense that, like, definitions are ways to organize our concepts. There's what is the definition of a bachelor? A definition of bachelor is an unmarried man. Like, that's fine just in terms of how we organize these different concepts, but life is just not something that can be easily defined that way. It just doesn't work. What we need to be doing instead is to be clawing our way to a theory of life, and so that it's okay that we can't define it. It's this phenomenon that we have a dim understanding of, and now we just need to do lots of experiments, do lots of field work and so on, and hopefully a theory that can explain life will emerge. So it can be. I mean, the problem is scientists cannot stop themselves from coming up with new definitions of life. They just keep coming out. There are hundreds of them now, and Carol Cleland is just saying, like, would you just please stop? Stop.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yes. Have you run across any scientists that have attempted to not define evolution by its hallmarks, but by its essence?
Well, I mean, I guess, you know, that's, sure. I mean, I'll give you one example. Like, I was in that meeting with these scientists who are trying to make life from scratch, and someone came up to me and said, like, well, obviously, life is translation. Now, what he meant was life is the process by which information encoded in genes is used to produce proteins. So for him, that's the essence. And then somebody else said to me, like, oh, it's reproduction. That's the essence. That's what really matters, you know. But again, like, here was somebody who, like, got a PhD in studying translation and someone who got a PhD in studying the reproduction of bacteria. It's like, often what people call the essence is what I think is incredibly cool, which is fine, but I don't think it gets us to really the essence as you're talking about it.
So before we all thank Carl Zimmer for joining us today, I just want to remind everybody that Carl has books for sale in the lobby, and he'll also be signing books out there as well right after the event. So please join me in thanking Carl Zimmer for being here today.
Thank you.